when I began teaching in the program in '71, you say, I hardly remember myself, it's been so long ago. There was mythology about the founding of the program, and some of that myth is probably, has a factual basis, and some of it probably doesn't. And the mythology was that it was a group of people, several Nobel Prize winners among them, largely from the biological sciences and the medical school, whose idea it was to found the program. And they wrote a proposal to the Ford Foundation for the funding to do this. One thing I can say factually, I have seen that proposal. It's absolutely amazing. I can't remember how many millions, but it's quite a few millions that they got. And the proposal is not even a whole page long. It was, people with very considerable reputations and Nobel Prizes that, of course the Ford Foundation would do it. The early conception of the program, as I understood it, and this has always been, to a certain degree, a point of tension in the program, and certainly for me, is that it was people in the medical and biological sciences who really wanted to involve the social sciences to tell them how to implement their solutions to all the big problems. What was missing, certainly from my perspective, is in fact the possibility that a lot of the more significant problems that we face in this country and elsewhere have its origins in the society, and they're not going to be solved necessarily by, fixes of a medical or biological sort. They might have to be solved by, social means. But it was never, I can't speak for the first couple of years, but certainly by the time I came involved in the program, when Colin Pindrick was one of the major participants, it didn't have that tone. It had much more the tone now that it has today of, two kinds of science, as it were, biological and medical on the one hand, and psychological and social on the other. I think I mentioned to the other day of Colin Pindrick, the first time I sat in on the course, I was standing up on the first day and saying that, two things have happened that really matter. The emergence of language and the emergence of the DNA, and that sort of set what we now call the A and B sides in the course. Craig and I had a module or a few lectures in human aggression and war, and it was very interesting. But Craig, he's a behavioral biologist, and he sees war as an expression of it is just aggression. He doesn't see it in social political terms, and coming it from much more my perspective, from a sort of quasi-Marxist perspective. This war isn't like children fighting on the playground. It's not just an expression of a human tendency. There's obviously something in human nature that allows this to happen and makes people willing to do it, but that isn't what creates war. It's larger social political problems. War probably has more to do with obedience, with strange kind of loyalties and so forth, than it does to do with aggression. Well, you could take the problem of, global warming in the context of this country, and enormous scientific effort is being put into, quote unquote, solving that problem, but they're looking for a technological fix. You could go back and do what was done during World War II and ration gasoline, and you could solve the problem within a very short time. But nobody is willing to do that because the standard that is set, and this is where the social sciences job, I think, is to challenge that, is to fix the problems without changing anything the way anybody's, what is popularly called their lifestyle. I mean, you know, if you have problems with population control, you can do what the Chinese did. You can introduce, mandatory birth controls and birth quotas and so forth. There are other kinds of solutions. Sometimes, they are not comfortable, but they need to be considered, and it also needs to be considered where the problem's coming from in the first place. I try, you can't go too far in this without, offending people, including your colleagues, but, students will always talk about the hard sciences and the soft sciences. And, in a sense, the A side represents the hard sciences, and the B side, the soft sciences. And I try early on to say, that's certainly true. There is no doubt that sociology has not reached anything like the level of understanding or sophistication as a science that human genetics has, for example. On the other hand, I think we have to make a contrast between the hard sciences and the easy sciences. And really, what we call the hard sciences are the easy sciences. I mean, you can experiment. You have infinite number of examples. You're no loss. You have huge funding. You don't have to run up against all kinds of prejudices and political problems to work in the area. And on the other hand, when you turn to aspects of human behavior, most everybody thinks that they understand it. And, the scientists usually in the beginning as well. Besides that, you cannot experiment in the same way, nor should you be allowed to. I have been interested and spent a greater part of my career in one proposition, the effect of early association on sexual attraction. Now, if we can imagine some world in which we had an experimental population, what we would do is we would take unrelated children in one large set and rear them together, and the other large set not introduce them to one another until they got to be adults, and see what effect that early association is against no association had on their sexual interest in one another. We can't do that. We shouldn't be allowed to do that. But nonetheless, that's the obvious and only really convincing way to go about that. That I have succeeded in addressing that problem is only because the Chinese, in fact, did that. And in large parts of China, people raised their sons' wives. And so couples who were boys and girls who were reared together were actually, in this case, forced to marry. You can compare that with the other form of marriage in the same communities in which they married their sons to girls that they brought into the family at 17 or 18 years of age. Now, even given that natural experiment, the difficulty then comes of how are you going to measure the effects of association or non-association. You can look at fertility rates, you can look at divorce rates, you can look at the frequency of adultery. But if you had to go out and collect that data through interviews and so forth, it would be extremely difficult. It would cost something like an aircraft carrier in order to collect data. Fortunately, I have been able to do that because the Japanese colonial government on Taiwan set up a household registration system in which they did it for me. But it's that kind of problem that is an enormous inhibition in the way of social science research. One, to find the natural situations, which are rare and in many cases simply don't exist, and in the other case, to actually collect the data, which, you have to be, you usually have to be dependent upon, to a large degree, on evidence that somebody else has collected for some other purpose. It's partly, it gets even more difficult when you get into it as an anthropologist, because while Stanford students being, coming from fairly well-to-do backgrounds, travel a great deal, they don't actually get to know anything much about the other societies they visit, partly because they're not very exotic societies. And you have to try to convince them, and this takes more imagination than it does really of intelligence, that there are a lot of different ways to be human. And it's not easy to do, because they have a sense that they know that already. You take a human being, and a human being isn't psychological or biological or anthropological or sociological. It's a history of the Western development or the Western sciences that these divisions were made. So in a sense, I see the program as a major task or a major contribution of trying to bridge, to overcome what are basically really artificial divisions. Now, that is not to say that the program always succeeds in that, because those are very difficult to overcome. The word discipline itself is interesting. Why would you apply the word discipline? Because people who belong to a department of this, they discipline their students, and particularly their graduate students, to approach things in a certain way, to use certain concepts, certain methodologies. And so education becomes a form of disciplining and creating, in a sense, a culture around one part of the subject matter. And there are many places in the country. I think if you're a graduate student in psychology and you were to go to your advisor and suggest, well, I think I'll actually go over and take a couple of courses in sociology, you wouldn't necessarily get encouragement. In fact, you might often be greatly discouraged in doing that. So I think that what the program is doing is, when looked at in terms of the reality of the world we live in, is not, it's doing what ought to be done. It's trying to overcome the residue of a history.